Well, thank you all for joining us. I'm so thrilled to have my great uncle, Bill Middendorf, joining us today for this session. Bill has been my role model in life, in business, in his interest in politics, and he's been such a major force in my life, motivated me to be a conservative and shared his views with me and has been an inspiration. And I hope that hearing some of the elements of his amazing life and business and politics will inspire you in some ways as it has me. And I think that you'll enjoy hearing some of Bill's amazing stories, which I grew up hearing. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and Bill would always stay with us when I was little, and he was down in Washington on his political trips from when I was little. And he has some amazing stories. He's worked with many presidents. He's served in a variety of roles, from Secretary of the Navy to Treasurer of Draft Goldwater, a trustee of the Heritage Foundation. Has been involved in almost every major conservative political movement since the 60s. And I'm thrilled to have him here. So thank you for joining us, Uncle Bill. Well, Bill, I want to dive right in. I want to start with your biography and some elements of your career. And then we'll talk about, next, we'll talk about Draft Goldwater and the conservative movement, and then the Cold War and your experiences as Secretary of the Navy. So, Bill, you've served in a wide variety of government positions, but you never ran for elected office. Why not?
Well, the reason I didn't run for elected office is I certainly didn't. I wanted to do some good, but I didn't want any of the publicity that you get from elected office. And besides, if you spend much time with elected officials, you'll notice that a large percentage of them are lawyers, and in many cases, failed ambulance chasing lawyers who can't really make much of a go of it as a small town lawyer, and when you get into government, as Congress or Senate, their benefits are about 5 times more than they can make in Ponca City, Oklahoma. And I didn't think, many of them that I got to know were wonderful people, particularly some of the Republican leaders in the Congress and some of the great Democrats like John Stennis and Bob Wilson, Republican, and so many others. But so many of them were really just false fronts.
What was the way you thought you had the biggest impact?
Cardboard printouts like Nelson Rockefeller.
Uncle Bill, so what was your strategy for having an impact on the country? What did you think as an individual your biggest role could be in changing the direction of the country?
You're dropping your voice, Dan, so.
Yeah, Uncle Bill, because you didn't run for elected office, what was your idea of how you could have the biggest impact on the country?
Well, you remember that the motherlode of politicians' election is cash, and Jerry and I were on the finance side, so we were usually the most desirable elements of any campaign. And whether it was president, I was treasurer for 2 or 3 presidents, and Jerry was finance chairman for 2 or 3 presidents. And I think I was treasurer, finance chairman for 25 or 30 different congressmen and senators. And as treasurer of the National Committee, I was very much involved in many financing many of the candidates. So I got to know all pretty well. And the day a congressman is elected is the day that he starts raising money for his next election. It's just a revolving door operation. So he's always desperate for money. So therefore they always love us, and I really enjoyed being in the background.
And Bill, what was your primary goal? I mean, when you think about where you wanted the country to go and the change that you wanted to have on the
Yeah.
country, what were you pushing?
My primary goal was always to have a very strong defense and have a strong free market capitalistic system with low taxes that permitted the free market to operate with individual carrying the bulk of the responsibility, not the government playing winners and losers.
Right. And so, Bill, I'd like to turn now to your early involvement with the Goldwater campaign. And first, I was wondering if you could talk about what the Republican Party was like in the early 60s when Goldwater first came onto the scene, and why you decided to back Goldwater.
Well, Goldwater, of course, was a businessman, very much like Trump. The trouble with businessmen in government and politics is that they have to make decisions, and they're trained to make decisions. And every time they say something, it's got to be based on cost-benefit ratio, whether it's going to be a sound decision or not. So they're not used to coming in to government and making promises. And then, of course, once they're in government, they say, well, I would have liked to have done all these things I promised, but this mean guy across the aisle voted against me. And they have an excuse.
Could you talk about I'd say the inter-party war between the Rockefeller Republicans and the Goldwater Republicans?
Well, Nelson Rockefeller was just part of the entire Thomas E. Dewey entire network of Republican Party since the war, or even before the war. We want Wilkie and all that. They were all, unfortunately, all the same breed. Big government knows best, and let's continue the high income taxes because the government picks winners and losers.
And how did Goldwater see it differently, Bill?
Well, Goldwater said, we've got to get the government off our backs. We need a strong defense. We need law and order that government can provide, and we need certain environmental protections and what have you that the government can provide. But 90% of the life of this country should be governed by the individual enterprise.
And I think, Bill, that this was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. It was against the consensus of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and certainly the university and the media. So where were you getting what inspired you? What inspired Goldwater? Where were these ideas coming from about free market?
These ideas were totally based on free market capitalism coming out of Goldwater department store and business, and a total free market idea that comes from Arizona anyway. But my ideas were primarily academic, coming from Schumpeter and von Mises, and the academic side I was very solid on, and also from Wall Street. Running a firm where it's give and take every day. Every day in Wall Street, you have to make decisions whether you live or die. Every day, it's your money on the line, not someone else's money on the line.
And how did people see you in Goldwater? Did you feel that there was personal animosity towards these ideas at the time?
No, I don't think there's any person. Goldwater was a very likable person. He was genuinely nice guy. He didn't have a bad bone in his body that I could tell. He did not.
Bill, did you feel like the media and the liberals were personally against you, that they thought Republicans who believed what you believed were bad people?
He fought back, but Nelson was the one that got down in the gutter and the convention and what have you. And call everybody that believed in free market capitalism and less government intervention and lower taxes. And he called us right-wing extremists.
And Bill, could you talk about the early days of the Goldwater campaign? I know you were one of the ones that introduced direct mail. Could you talk about some of the tactics that you used?
Well, we couldn't raise any money out of Wall Street because they were all paying protection money to the Democrats, just as all the billionaires today, Facebook and Google and Amazon and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett all pay protection money today to the Democrats because they know the Democrats won't, if they buy them off, they won't hurt them. They know that the Republicans will love them because they're free market, because they're businessmen. So they have nothing to fear from the Republicans. So they all benefit from the free market capitalism. That's how they make their money. But when they go home at night and write out the checks, they write out the checks, big checks for all the left-wing Democrat Party for protection money.
And what about your use of direct mail, Bill? Could you talk about that?
Well, since we couldn't get anywhere with the protection money payments of Wall Street, and which in those days they were the dominant money people, we had to go direct mail, and we had. Whereas Lyndon Johnson had something like 18,000 contributors, I can't remember, 15,000 contributors. We had 1 million contributors contributing $10 or $15 a piece. In those days, it was a lot of money. We raised $22 million. That's a lot of money, but that was mostly almost all from small $10, $15 contributors. In other words, it had a twofold benefit. One, it paid for the campaign. Number two, it energized 1 million people to become part of the campaign. And once you put the $10 down, you became energized for life. And so that was part of our base, a major part of our base going forward for the next 5 elections.
And you think there was something different about those people that, that they were not having an influence on politics before you introduced direct mail, and that perhaps you were expanding the pool of people that could have a voice?
Well, nobody had ever done the direct mail idea before to the scale we did. It was always tapping the rich people. I was a precinct captain in the Thomas E. Dewey campaign of 1948. For the 8th Assembly District in New York. And there we counted on and were able to get I guess I would say we could count on 1 or 2 hands, 90% of the funds that came into for financing our particular district.
Wow. So Bill, you called in your first, or one of your, I guess maybe your second book, you called the Goldwater campaign a glorious disaster. Why was it a glorious disaster?
Well, it was a glorious success, but it was also a glorious disaster. So it was sort of a play. It was glorious, but also a disaster. Glorious in that we went on to win. We took control of the party. And the whole conservative movement took control of the party, and we went on to win 5 out of the next 6 elections, and 7 out of the next 10.
And who else was there with you, Bill? That you would
Peter O'Donnell was the state chairman of Texas, and we had a wonderful team, a wonderful group of John Grenier. A wonderful group of politically active state chairmen around the country who were fed up with the Rockefeller liberal Democrat Republican
And is it on the Goldwater campaign that you first met Reagan, Uncle Bill?
Yes, and in fact, what happened was that as treasurer, and I had to raise the money, but Barry asked me there was a young man out in California, there were two young men out in California, Nixon and Barry and Ronald Reagan. Reagan was then a broadcaster for General Electric, and so Ronald Reagan was. I was put in charge of sending him material every day for his speeches. Not that he needed any guidance, but I just had to. We had to coordinate the campaign, so I sent him the material, the campaign's directions each day. That's a water, friend. And also Nixon, Goldwater. Reagan wouldn't fly. It would work within the state of California. Nixon would fly anywhere. One occasion, Nixon flew out to Hawaii. He went over to Nevada. I think made two other state visits, all in 3 days for us. Speaking, he made.
What were your first impressions of Reagan and Nixon, or what were they like as people?
Well, Reagan was always wonderful to work with. He was such a genial guy. He was so humble. He always made jokes about himself. I never heard him speak ill of a single person. He carried that on to his cabinet meetings. And I remember he'd come into every cabinet meeting or every meeting. And let me take a sip of this crap here. That's all old stuff, man. So he'd come into every meeting, and before he said anything, before he called the meeting to order, he'd always tell a joke. Well, the joke was always on himself. Like he'd say something like, "I just had a call from Maggie Thatcher, and she said, I'm going squishy today. She's going to come over and handbag me." So he always make fun of himself, but I never heard him once in the 30 years or 40 years, 35 years I knew him, say anything unkind about anybody else, never. And and he never said anything. He never boasted about himself either. Curiously enough, George Bush was the same way. George Bush's mother and father were great friends of mine in Greenwich. And Dorothy Bush would tell George when he came home from Greenwich Country Day, he'd say he hit a home run. He was a famous baseball player at Yale. And she said, "Mom, I hit a home run today." She said, "I never want you to ever use the word I." And he never did after that.
What about Nixon, Uncle Bill? What was Nixon like?
Nixon was a different breed of cats entirely. He was a brooding kind of a guy in a way. He was 100% all politics. He was a lawyer, and he was supported by Don Kendall of Pepsi-Cola, who gave him the chance to practice before the Supreme Court on a few jobs. And when Middendorf Colgate and Company, when Nixon came back from the 1960 failed campaign for president, he joined the firm of Baldwin Todd and Tucker, and they changed the name of the firm to Baldwin Todd Mitchell, I think, and Nixon. I can't remember the full name. And I hired Nixon. My firm hired Nixon, as other firms did, Nixon's firm, for municipal bond work. And but he would come to meetings for John Mitchell, who later became Secretary of the Treasury. John Mitchell did all the work on municipal bonds. He was the world's leading authority on municipal bonds. And Nixon was not really interested in the law to the degree that we needed, not the precise level, but he had the gift of I don't like to use the word gab, but language, and he was a great politician. And to his credit, after the 1960 election, which was stolen from him in Chicago when they packed the mail-in ballots and that fraud, and everybody knew it was a fraud, he decided not to challenge the vote and let it go. He said, "I'll have another shot," and he did in 1968.
So, Bill, I'd like now to move on to the Cold War, which is obviously a huge part of your career. When you were Secretary of the Navy, you sponsored the Aegis missile system, the Trident submarine and missile programs, and the F-18 program. Can you talk about the importance of these military systems to our fights against communism?
Well, coming out of the Vietnam War, the Congress, which was dominated by the Democrats in the early 70s, was very anxious to have a peace dividend. So, in other words, very much like the recent Bush-Obama years, where they sequestered defense and cut 40% out of our long lead time programs. The same thing was true in the early 70s. The liberal Democrats said that let's put the money into vote-buying welfare programs, and so they cut heavily. They wanted to cut heavily into the defense budget, and I saw that. I knew that it was a 10-year lead time to build any major weapons systems, and I knew that we were way behind the curve on the Soviet Union at that time. The Soviet Union was spending almost at least half or more of their defense, of their gross national product on military, even though they were basically bankrupt. Somebody described the Soviet Union as a gas station with nukes. They're willing to spend most of their GDP, or a large part of it, on military. They're even doing that today. It's out of proportion and let the people starve, so to speak. So I was able to persuade the Congress that we had to build against the Great Nightfall, which I predicted the apogee of the Cold War to be in the late 1980s. And I said it takes 10 years to build these weapons. And despite the peace dividend movement, I was able to get John Stennis, the head chairman of the Armed Services Committee, and a number of other very patriotic, wonderful members of the Armed Services Committees in Congress and the Senate to support me. And we built these long lead time, 10, 12-year long lead time weapon systems that came online and were key elements in winning the Cold War and breaking the back of the Soviet Union at the right moment in the late 1980s. And
what was the key to winning the Cold War, Bill? What were your key lessons from foreign policy lessons from being a Cold War career?
The Trident submarine, and when we had the postmortem in Moscow with my counterparts in the early 1990s, the Soviets military invited us over to have a postmortem and discuss the Cold War. By that time, they had moved away and become Russia, and it's no longer Soviet Union. And they were willing to talk openly, and they were willing to give credit to our foresight in building quite a few key weapon systems that broke their backs, and they couldn't compete with it, including the three that I mentioned.
Wow. And Bill, do you think there's any conflict between libertarianism and a strong defense? I mean, on the one hand, libertarians seem to be saying, well, we want less government and no government. And on the other hand, the defense, you need a big, strong government. Is there any conflict intellectually or not?
Well, the primary role of government is to protect the American people and from forces foreign and domestic. But it would be an impeachable offense if the president and his allies in the Congress that didn't support a strong defense to protect the American people in the face of the greatest military buildup that dwarfs World War II and dwarfs the Cold War that's going on right now.
So, Bill, what is the great military threat facing America today?
Well, I would certainly say the alliance, this new alliance of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. The fact that they're having joint exercises and coming together is a threat that is by orders of magnitude greater than any threat that that we faced in the late 1980s or in World War II, by orders of magnitude.
What makes the Chinese such a major threat to us?
Well, there's several areas. Mainly, they're extremely well financed, and I'll get into that where that money comes from in a moment, if you're interested. Mostly from us, but we've been financing their weapon systems. But they're developing. They have developed these hypersonic glide missiles at 13,000 miles an hour. We have no defense against. The Russians the same. They can reach any city in America now with nuclear warheads and missiles in 18 minutes from their own homelands. They've developed tremendous abilities in non-conventional warfare, and cyber, and AI, and anti-satellite capabilities, and EMP threats, where we lie absolutely naked. They can take out our utilities with one or two strikes, a nuclear strike over Omaha, for example, and where we'd be blacked out for 8 or 9 months. The Pentagon says we would lose probably 80% of the population. It'd just be total chaos, and no food, no nothing. We have no defense. You think this little virus has incapacitated us? Can you imagine knocking out our electrical grid, which China and Russia are capable of doing any time, by the way? And also they've developed these undersea capabilities. And by the way, we're not defenseless there. We're working in that area too. But we allowed ourselves over the last 12 to 15 years through the sequester of George Bush and Obama to, in a sense, disarm in many critical areas, looking for so-called peace dividends. And while our enemies, potential enemies in the new Cold War have raced ahead.
How are they financing this buildup, Uncle Bill?
What's that?
How are the Chinese financing this matter?
Well, there are several ways the Chinese have financed it. It's appalling. Most people have no idea. First of all, they've been running up $500 billion surplus, trade surpluses with us, hard dollar surpluses with us year after year after year. That amounts to many trillions of dollars. over the last decade. Second of all, they've stolen through our intellectual property to the tune of at least 300 or 400 billion, some people say more, a year, and then use it against us and turn around and wiped out the profits of many of our companies by selling our products that we've developed through expensive research development abroad around the world. That amounts to 300 or 400 or 500 billion dollars a year. That's several trillions of dollars. And fourth and third, they have several hundred companies listed on our stock exchanges and NASDAQ and the rest. And they've raised money at great volume. Some estimates, Frank Robinson estimates possibly as much as $3 trillion of hard dollars, hard U.S. dollars from our own stock exchanges to finance their weapon systems and their economy, which has enjoyed 6 or 8% growth over the last 15 or 20 years, all pretty much at our expense. And all those hard dollars have built weapon systems that are all aimed at us to kill us with.
Could you talk, Uncle Bill, about their unconventional tactics? How do they, we have such a huge advanced military. How have they been able to figure out ways to attack us?
You talk about our huge advanced military. We have a tooth to tail ratio, which is a military term we use in the Pentagon, 50-50, more or less, whereby for every soldier or sailor behind him is another 50% expense, bookkeepers and environmentalists and lawyers and what have you, to keep him honest and equipped. In China, their tooth to tail ratio may be just a fraction of that. maybe 5% or 3%, because they pay their people practically nothing. So they can put their weapon systems. They can what the dollars they spend can buy. They get much bigger bang for the buck. Same with Russia. They have
How did they take out, our advanced carrier systems or our submarines that we've poured so much money into building?
Certainly can. They have something. They have missiles that can spray the decks of a carrier. The DF-21 missile can spray the decks of a carrier with several hundred missiles that can knock out the planes. It can't sink the carrier, but the carrier without planes is worthless. Some people say the carriers are great symbols of America, but today they're World War II. We're fighting the third new war, the new Cold War, with World War II weapons. As we fought World War II, we began World War II with the battleships, which is World War I weapons.
What do we need to do, Uncle Bill? What weapon systems do we need to focus on developing now in order to win the new Cold War?
We have to develop space capability weapon systems as they are doing, both China and Russia, very rapidly, and anti-satellite capabilities. We have to develop those much more rapidly, as we know they're doing. We have to stop their ability, which is their cyber capabilities of downloading just about every piece of information we have of military value and of industrial value, which they have the capability of doing. We had a war game at the Naval War College 2 years ago, and which I chaired, and I was very disappointed with the results. We're poorly equipped we are to stop the Chinese, in particular, capabilities in cyber, so that our weapon systems, for example, our new F-35, which the body of which, by the way, is not made in America, it's made in Turkey. It shows how dependent we are on other people. And by the way, a whole lot of our weapon systems are made in China, on which we depend too. We've given up pretty much manufacturing in this country. We're 60 to 70% consumer industry, consumer orientated country, and we've turned the manufacturing of the world over to China pretty much. But it comes down in China, the F-35, to our surprise, it shouldn't have been to our surprise, but the new fighter, the new Chinese fighter, is an identical mock-up of our F-35. It looks almost identical. And that was supposed to be our main line of aviation of defense. So we've been caught napping, and we've just got to move fast now, as we did in the early 70s when we've got to build the long lead time programs that won the Cold War, helped win the Cold War. We've got to do that again. We've got to repeat that now. It's going to take us 10 years, 8 to 10 years to build the long lead time programs, to rebuild from the debris that we were left by the fatal, I think, near fatal mistake of disarming in the last 12 years.
So, Uncle Bill, you were ambassador to the European community and instrumental in forming the trade agreements that led to the creation of the European Union, and have fought for many, many years for free trade deals. Could you talk about your belief in free trade and talk about how that's changed over time?
Well, after the war, and I was part of it, all of us thought that we had to give one-way, in effect, one-way free trade to Europe, particularly Germany and even Japan, to get them back on their feet so that we could have a strong Europe as an antidote to the Soviet Union, which then was our main threat. And we needed a strong economic trade union in Europe. It was then called the European Common Market. It came out of the European Coal and Iron Community, which Mr. Mansell founded, a Dutchman. And then it became the European Union afterwards. So we built up Europe, and we built up Japan, and then Kissinger and Nixon in the gave one-way free trade. In a sense, we would allow them to charge 25% tariffs on our cars, and we didn't charge them any tariffs on their cars. So we had a whole lot of Toyotas and Mercedes-Benz running around our country. And manufacturing in Detroit and Cleveland sort of became ghost towns and decrepit over the years. And then Henry Kissinger and Nixon, in order to counterbalance the Soviet Union, decided to build up China and open up China and have them and do everything we could to have them economically viable and to offset the Soviet Union and its counterpart. And they were wildly successful in that. But what we didn't know, we were opening up Pandora's box, and now China has turned belligerent.
Wow. Well, Bill, I want to turn the final section of this interview to some more personal questions. My first is, I think that many people, including me, didn't know that you and your wife, Isabel, who passed away recently, fostered over 20 African American children during your time in Washington. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my daughter reminds me that it wasn't 28 African American, it was about 20 African American, but there were at least 8 or 10 Hispanic or white children also over a period of 10 years. My wife was a registered nurse. She trained at Children's Hospital. She was a wonderful, wonderful she just believed in all humanity and certainly and children. She just loved children with a passion, babies. And so she went to a couple of adoption agencies, and one of them was what was the name of it? Barker Adoption Agency, that was set up during World War II to work with Navy wives, and they were very, very helpful. And so every month or so we'd have a new baby in the house, and she was in her element, taking care of them. And we had 5 children of our own too, but she was just a saint.
Did that shape any of your political beliefs or actions, Uncle Bill, that experience of working with Isabel to foster those children?
Well, as I think I sort of said the admirals are prompt people. I'm not prompt, but the admirals like 6:30 meetings in the morning, and so I'd have to be there at 6:30 or 7 every morning, and because they're pretty sharp at that time, and I'm afraid on several occasions, having done a little. Sometimes Isabel, she always did most of the work, but sometimes, God bless her, sometimes she got so exhausted that I had to do diaper changing and burping in the middle of the night, and I didn't get a lot of sleep some nights. So, in a sort of a humorous way, I said, when I showed up at the 6:30 meetings with the admirals, I hope I wasn't putting the country in jeopardy.
Well, Uncle Bill, I wanted to turn to 2 other parts of your life that I know have been very important to you. The first is art. You've been a painter, a composer, a collector. Could you talk about the role that art has played in your life?
Well, I was just, my whole family is really into art. My daughter is a tremendous artist and a teacher, and Franny, and my son John is a artist in a way. He's architect of designs for portaledges for mountain climbers, and my other son Roxy is a fabulous artist, sculptor, a leading sculptor in America. And I'm not an artist. I'm sort of a recorder. I like to draw a lot. I've drawn a lot of all the world leaders and all my friends over the years. I have a couple thousand sketches that I'm putting together in 5 books right now, which I'm privately printing at Riverside Arts. And 3 of the books will be on the family, 1,000 sketches of family growing up, the kids, and then 2 of them, one will be on the art historians, and one will be on all of my friends and public figures that I've dealt with, that I've sketched over the years. Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher told Ronald Reagan took me aside one time and he said, Maggie just told me that she considers you one of my best ambassadors. And I said, and Ronnie said to Maggie, he said, Bill, I like Bill, but why do you say that? He said, and she said, well, because he's always taking such careful notes on all my speeches. Well, as a businessman, and I have never once taken a note on any politician's speeches in my life, and I think I've heard, I think I have a memory of listening to over 4,000 speeches in my career. I can't remember a word any of them ever said that was memorable outside of a few. And where Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, and a few things like that. But the rest of the politicians were like Nelson Rockefeller, who ended every speech with his famous bomb fog quote. He was a cardboard cutout, but every speech he got standing ovation by saying, and I must have heard 50 of his speeches with the famous bomb fog at the end. So I ended up calling him Mr. Bomb Fog. Bomb Fog was brotherhood of man, fatherhood of God, which was the tail end of every one of his speeches. And of course, that's the only thing I can remember from his speeches. And I'm wondering, let's turn it around to you. How many memorable speeches have you heard from Boston councilmen and your representative?
I think my time would have been better spent drawing them than taking notes too, Bill. I think it's all empty words for the most part.
Well, at any rate, Margaret Thatcher, 6 years ago, came to the Heritage Foundation for sort of on a farewell trip. She was dying, I think. And she gave us $10 million to my foundation. And so she's our honorary chairman, by the way. And so I brought out the 3 sketches that I'd made of her because what she thought I was taking notes of was really sketching her. And she roared with laughter. She saw the humor of it. And she wrote nice little notes underneath all 3 sketches to Bill, my best friend or good friend, or something like that, Margaret Thatcher, which I cherish. I treasure those little sketches. But I warn you, if you're going to take notes on politicians' speeches, I think you should get some sort of special pills from the doctor.
Well, Bill, tell us about you were instrumental in founding the Heritage Foundation. Why did you do that, and what impact has the Heritage Foundation had?
Heritage Foundation was founded by Ed Fulner and several others, Dick Scaife and Joe Kors. The 3 of them founded it in 1976, and it was in a sense following through on the Goldwater team's conservative battle, and because all 3 of them had been key players in our 1964 campaign. And so they wanted to set up a foundation to think tank because most of in fact, all the think tanks at that time, Brookings Institute and all the rest were on the left, very much Democrat controlled. And so I wanted to join the board then, but I couldn't because Ed Fulner said, being Secretary of the Navy, you're in the government, we can't do that. But sooner or later, a couple of years later, was when I was in Washington, when I took over a large bank down there, he said, "Come on board." So I did.
And what was it like being Secretary of the Navy, Bill?
Well, the Secretary of the Navy is, you just can't believe the experience of being with so many patriots. And because everyone there has one mission, is protect America. And they're highly trained, and they're all, it's a tremendously unified group. There are no racial divisions or anything. We're 25% black, but it's all one group. Some of our best admirals were black and what have you, and Hispanic. And so nobody ever thought anything about all this racial division has come up now. And but there's just, I guess it's just so wonderful to be as 4 years with those people. And it wasn't just 4 years with those people. Since it's been a lifetime for me since I was active for 40 years running. I was founding chairman of the U.S. Navy Memorial. I was president of the Naval War College Foundation. I founded,
And the
co-founded.
Marine Corps Marathon. You've got to tell that story, Bill.
I ran 8 of the marathons, and I was elected to the Marine Corps Marathon Hall of Fame. Not for my speed, by the way. I was a very poor, very slow runner. My best time was 4 hours and 21 minutes, which is exactly 2 hours after the winter.
Bill, you've lived much of your recent life on a farm in Little Compton, Rhode Island. Could you talk about your attachment to farming?
Well, I just, for 60 years, I've had these wonderful cows, and just so, I just love the seasons and see the cows. And now my daughter's got a few donkeys, got some wonderful donkeys, and Buttercup, Tulip, and Lagosa. And we have a half-blind horse, and so it's just a wonderful experience. I don't.
Do the cows remind you at all of our politics in any way, Uncle Bill?
No, but my father raised cows, and so I just loved that. Maybe it's because of that. And I worked on a farm when I was a kid, and also my father raised Black Angus, and several times we would go to Gettysburg, and over the fence, retired General Eisenhower would negotiate over the fence with Dad over the price of these wonderful Black Angus that Dad would graze, the best in the country. In the 1960s, the Black Angus that sold the best to General Eisenhower and anyone else that was buying Angus were those that had the bellies all the way down to the ground, because nobody was focusing on health in those days. It was just how much fat you could put on Angus. Today, you can't sell a cow like that.
Yeah.
That much more lean.
And Bill, that reminds me, hearing about your father, the story about the bankruptcy in 1908, and your father. Yes, could you talk about? I think that story. I know it shaped you. Maybe you could talk about their experience and how it affected you. Well,
your great grandfather founded many of the railways in the South and many of the public utilities in the South, Virginia Electric and Power, and he was the founder of Maryland Casualty, and uh, I'd say 15 different public utilities, and he was the founder of the Seaboard Coastline Railroad, and he was fighting Jay Gould and those robber barons all the time in the 1880s and 90s, and it was quite successful. And his name was John William Middendorf Senior, and so in 1903, in the crash of 1903, he was in England and he sent a telegram to his partner, J. Skelton Williams in Richmond, and to sell everything because Bank of England was in a crisis mode, and he thought that that crisis would come to America, which it did. And Williams didn't believe him, and in those days people had cubbyhole desks, and he put the telegram, which still remained in my uncle's and father's pigeonhole desk when I worked there in the 1930s, and sell everything, and he just pigeonholed it. And the crash came in 1903, and so they lost everything, and he ended up with a $5 million debt because they were all loaded up with debt. And of course, gentlemen in those days didn't go bankrupt. There was no bankruptcy arrangement for gentlemen because everything was gentlemen, so to speak. So, and my father and uncle, when they came back from World War I from France, went to work for Dillon Reed, Doug Dillon and that crowd, and then started their own firm in Baltimore, Middendorf and Company, and dollar by dollar paid back the $5 million that Granddaddy owed. And I remember in 1928, Granddaddy told us that the happiest moment of his life was that the debt was paid off, and he died shortly thereafter. And so the debt was paid off.
Well, Bill, you served in World War II, and I know many of us call your generation the greatest generation. When you reflect on the values and maybe the sense of honor or the sense of what it means to be American, what are the values that you think define your generation of Americans? And as you reflect, what do you think are the values that define what it is to be an American?
Well, of course, everything is absolutely pro-American, and it was really, it was just so, everybody was such a patriot for America. You don't hear any of the criticism, never heard any of the criticisms you hear now. People make all these strange remarks about America. Such a great country, and it's been so great for so long. It's got its faults, but I've spent some time in Europe and in several ambassadorships abroad, and I can tell you that Europe has created far more history than it can absorb, and not all of it's good.
Well, Bill, as a final question, everyone in Teneo is, under the age of 40 and engaged in conservative politics in some way or another. But some are businessmen, some are in elected office, some are lawyers. What advice would you have for the next generation of conservatives about, you've had such success in your career, taking over the Republican Party, changing the direction of this country, winning the Cold War. What can you tell this next generation about how they can win?
When you say win, I had success. It was always a team effort. Always a whole bunch of us, like-minded people working together. It was never any individual effort. It was just like-minded team players, and that's the way it always has to be. But I would say that if I were a young man, I would say make good in your career first before you go into government. It's a horrible statement to make, but always rise to the top. It's far too competitive at the bottom. And so my recommendation is to be very successful in your business career or your legal career or academic career or what have you. So you're economically well enough. So you're an independent individual spirit, and you can't be subservient, so to speak. And you don't have to fight for your, so that you can become a leader. And then once you're a leader, then people will respect you and look up to you, and you can have a voice. But if you're just looking for a low-paying staff job in some campaign, forget it. You'll be treated like dirt.
And what about your advice, Bill? You're 95. As you look back on your life, what advice would you share with all of the young people on this call about how to live a good life?
Well, first of all, I'd say, and I think I've told Franny this and others, always get out into the arena and get out there and make decisions, do things, and take your shots. And not because you're going to succeed every time, but because you're going to fail a lot of times. And the only lesson you ever learned is to have it pounded into you. The failures is the only thing I know, because I don't think I'm very smart. I think I'm just old enough to have been kicked around by experts long enough, so that my lower middle class mind can finally absorb the fact that I learned something by being kicked around, and I won't make those mistakes again. So get out into the arena, make your early mistakes, because they don't cost you much in the beginning. If you make them at my age, it costs you too much. And so please get out into the arena, make decisions, do things, be willing to take a chance, and you'll do well. And you won't make those mistakes that I made.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for doing this. I think this has been a wonderful interview.